Jerusalem, Israel. This is From the Midwest to the Middle East, the podcast that explores everything new in U.S. and Israeli economy. Here's your host, Philip Stein.
I'm very excited today to have a colleague, a friend, someone I've known for many years, Professor Dan Ben David. His name is very well known here in Israel. He's currently the head of the Shoresh Institution for Socioeconomic Research and a senior faculty member in the Department of Public Policy at Tel Aviv University. Besides everything else, Dan has a PhD from the University of Chicago, and anyone who follows this podcast knows that where I'm from. And Dan, before we get started, many years ago, I had a good friend who was on a lobbying trip to Washington, D.C. For pro-Israel public policy, and he was sent to Senator Dixon, who was a senator from Illinois, who's going to be retiring soon. And they're throwing all kinds of questions at him, and he raised in and he says, "One more question I'll give you." So he says, Cubs or Sox? So that's, you from Chicago. Were you a Cub or Sox fan, or neither?
Cubs and Bears. Actually, Bears particularly.
Okay, the Bears. What years were you there?
We lived in the good years for Bears and Bulls, actually.
That was the golden age. All right, so there's a lot going on today contemporarily, but I want to take a little trip back in history based on things that you've written. And let's sort of go back in time to the 70s. What exactly happened in the 70s that caused Israel to veer off its rapid growth path? And how does that shift continue to affect us today?
Wars tend to shake things up sometimes, not always. One of the prevailing attributes of growth paths is that they're very steady. It's very difficult to move a country from its long-run growth path. When I talk about growth, I'm talking about GDP per capita, the standard of living. And even after World War I, for example, we don't see changes in many European countries. The change happened after World War. It has been on the same path for 150 years. It's a very steady growth path, no change in their path. We were on a steady path from the birth of Israel until the Yom Kippur War. It was a very, very steep path, meaning we were growing very, very quickly. Countries. We were doing things that today we know much better to attribute things that caused growth, and that's infrastructure. It's the human capital infrastructure. We built universities by the mid-70s. Mm-hmm. We had early 70s, in fact, the number of research faculty per capita within 25 years of the birth of Israel by the mid-70s reached American levels, almost reached American levels. That's how fast it happened, which paved the way for future high-tech. We built roads, we built towns. In terms of the congestion on the roads, in 1970, we had the same congestion as the small European countries. And then came the Yom Kippur War, and that caused everything to shake to the core here. And in the end, we ended up throwing not just the bathwater, but the baby. We changed our national priorities. We moved to things that basically benefit the entire economy, the entire populace, to more sectoral, to more personal, populist directions. And the neglect is very clear. I mean, we just pivoted to a much slower long-run path, one that instead of catching up with the leading countries has been steadily taking us further and further behind. It's not, just to give you a sense, the U.S. has been growing at roughly 2% a year through 2007. It's a little bit under trend since the Great Recession. 1973, we've been on a path that's about 1.8%. So wow. The difference, 2%, doesn't seem like a lot, but it's compounded interest, right? So the gap between the U.S. and other countries and us grows. And that means that it's increasingly difficult for Israel to keep its best and brightest here, those with options to go abroad and earn a lot more. We have been able to keep, and we have been in a situation that we've been able to maintain, but it's unsustainable. And that's the key issue here. About half the kids in Israel today, because of the developments that we've had, half the kids in Israel today are receiving a third world education. Their levels in math, science, and reading are below many third world countries. These children belong to the fastest growing parts of the population, which means that without a first world economy, we won't have first world healthcare or welfare. But more to the point, especially of the past several weeks, we won't have a first world army. We won't be able to do the things that basically kept us. Who does that? I don't know what will be our needs in 20, 30 years, but if we won't have the technology and the ability to deal with it, then we're looking at very existential issues here. We don't have the option of becoming a third world country. is just not an option.
Yeah, that
Other
makes
countries
sense.
saying they want to wipe it off the map.
So in terms of what you mentioned about how we change trajectory, you point out that today only about 20% of Israelis, well, they pay 93% of income taxes. How sustainable? I guess what you're saying is it isn't sustainable. And what if it happens if that 20% or some of that 20% decide, as you say, to go to greener pastures or where there's better opportunities?
Well, it's all related to the same issue. I mean, the debate in all developed countries, including in Israel, is often the wrong debate. Are we more socialist and worry about the poor and impoverished and inequality, or are we greedy capitalists and all we care about is economic growth? And that we have to find an optimum between the two. It's the wrong question, basically. It's the wrong issue. It's an issue. In other words, I have poor. How do I help them? Give them money. But if I give them money, I have to increase taxes. When I increase taxes, I inhibit the desire to work, to invest. That hurts growth, and that's where you get the either or. But if you give people the tools to work, if you give them a much better education, the kind of education that a country with some of the best universities in the world is capable of giving, if you give them that education, if you connect them in a small country like Israel, what we call peripheries should be suburbs, basically. If you connect them to the jobs, to the opportunities, clearly you're helping them out, but we're helping ourselves out first and foremost. I mean, we're not doing anyone any favors here. And obviously it's going to reduce poverty and inequality, but it's also going to basically increase the number of cylinders in our national engine. We're going to be able to move faster. I mean, today, only 10% of the workforce is in high tech. High tech has productivity 25% above the OECD. Everybody else, 90% of the workforce, on average, is productivity 40% below the OECD. It's like two countries in one. We need to bring these guys into this world, and basically that will solve the problem of taxes and so on, and solve a host of different problems. But right now, I mean, the what you referred to, that statistic, today it's 93%. What 20% of the population pay is 93% of the income tax. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it was only 83%. It's edging upward because we're not including more and more of the population. And so we need to bring them into the program, and that's not happening.
So when you refer to that our kids are getting a third world education, I guess one could jump to the assumption maybe that's in the Haredi sector and the Arab sector, but does that also apply to the Jewish, let's say the Jewish non-Haredi sector?
It does. First of all, the Haredi boys don't even study the material. They don't take the international exams. So they're not even the reason why Israel over the past 20 years has been below basically the entire developed world in math, reading, and science. It's not because of the Haredim, it's because of the rest of us. The Arab kids in Israel, so the Haredim are 22% of the first graders. Another group that's 22% of the first grader are the Arab kids. Those kids, on average, obviously you always have exceptions to the rule, but on average, their scoring been below not just many third world countries. If you compare our Arab children to those of the Arab countries that participated in the most recent PISA exam, for example, 6 countries, our kids are below half of them, below 3 of the Arab countries that participated in the exam. So they're 22% of the first graders. The Haredim are 22%. And then we have what we call the periphery that I referred to earlier, the social periphery or the geographic periphery, where there's a huge gap between what they're studying, the level that they're studying, the opportunities that open or do not open up before them as adults. And that's what I meant, roughly speaking, about half. But it doesn't, a number on it, it doesn't even matter because for sure they belong to the fastest growing parts of the population. There's no doubt about it. The more educated parts of Israel have 2 children per family, be they secular Jews or Christian Arabs or the Druze, two children per family. Sotim, traditional Jews, 2.4. Religious Jews hovers around 4 children per family. Haredim, 6.5, 6.4. And the Muslim Arabs, it's around 3. But the bottom line is that the poorest parts of Israel, the ones that need the education the most, have the highest fertility rates. And that's going to be a problem, not just for them, for all the rest of us here.
In your report that you recently put out, and actually it's something that I professionally deal with, we do a lot of relocations. They don't call it emigration, they call it relocation. And sometimes it is it's just, there's an opportunity, there's in the high tech or in the academic, as you are well aware of, people go for several years. But you do use the this term spiral of collapse. If immigration accelerates amongst the country's most skilled professionals, which I assume you're referring to the high-tech sector, what could trigger that tipping point, and can we still reverse it?
Well, first I'll explain what it is. I mean,
Okay.
the term spiral of collapse refers to countries that are mismanaged to the point where people lose hope. And then when people lose hope, those who are able to leave, and those who are able to are generally the more educated, the more skilled. You could see it in Venezuela, for example, when Hugo Chavez took a country rich in oil and basically trashed it. And you can't find a doctor today in Venezuela. You can't, it's that's the way things are there. Another country much closer to home is Lebanon, Paris of the Middle East. That's what they used to call Beirut until the 70s. But when the Civil War broke out and the fact that they couldn't control the terror in the country, most of the educated and skilled are a critical mass left. And they're living abroad. And look at Lebanon today. And look at Ukraine and Russia, by the way. Massive immigration of physicians, of engineers from both countries, in some cases through Israel. We're kind of a stopping station where they pick up rights and money and then they go on. The concern is that is a process that may have already begun in Israel. It's not in high gear. What I mean by already begun, if we look at Israeli physicians in the OECD countries as a share of all the physicians in Israel, it's a low share, but it's doubled over the past 20 years. And that's before the past 2.5 years that everything went crazy here. So there are these long-term processes where we see more and more educated Israelis giving up and leaving. The spiral of collapse term that we're referring to here came from a letter written by 130 of Israel's top economists about a year ago, at the end of May 2024. And this is the first time that I've ever seen basically the elite of Israel's economists, be they right-wing or left-wing or religious and secular among them, all coming to the same conclusion that the country is basically existential danger. We as academics tend to hedge everything. We put a million footnotes. We say one thing in the text and then the footnotes say, yeah, but in other cases it could be. This is not a case of footnotes. This was very, very clear. And the primary warning of this letter was, look, we may be looking at an upcoming spiral of collapse in Israel, where the first to leave will be the ones who have it the easiest ability to leave, but then the burden on all the rest will grow so that even those who didn't contemplate leaving may start to contemplate it, and then it becomes like a bank run. You don't want to be the last one to turn off the lights among those who can leave. I don't think we're there yet. I also think that the past 2.5 years, which are the most awful years in Israel's history, also provide an opportunity. We got a glimpse of the future, basically, We have, this is no longer, again, a right-wing, left-wing issue. This is, in my opinion, a democracy versus a danger to democracy issue. And the majority in this government today, the partners of the Likud, are parties that won't lead a criminal defendant in 20, 30 years to create a government like the kind we've seen today. Their birth rates are such that they will be able to have any kind of government they want. They'll be able to do anything they want. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Because we had a glimpse also of the future when we look at towns in Israel, Jerusalem, that as it became, over time, secular Jews left. If you look at the primary schools, the secular schools comprised a third of the kids in Jerusalem just 3.5 decades ago. They're only 9% of the children today. Oh. The religious Jews, the non-Haredi religious Jews, were about 25%. Today, they're 11%. They're basically driving out those who are the most skilled, the most educated. Now, that's Jerusalem. That's the process we've seen for a while. But since the Haredi birth rates are so fast, are so large, they have to live somewhere. So we either build them towns for Haredim, where there's a spillover into other towns. And when we looked at the towns that fell the furthest in the socioeconomic rankings in Israel, 4 such towns fell the furthest. Jerusalem, which I mentioned, Arad, Bet Shemesh, and Givat Ze'ev. The other 3, you see a transformation in the population. It began a little bit earlier in Bet Shemesh, but they went from a third of the kids being Haredi just in the year 2000 to 85% today.
Wow.
Just like that.
Amazing.
And a few in the religious non-Haredi. And just a very few Haredim, I think it was 15 or 20%. Today, 25 years later, 24 years later, 75% of the primary school kids are Haredim. It happens very quickly. Givat Ze'ev had no Haredi kids in its school system. By the year prior, 78% of the children. When they move in, they basically drive everybody else out. You can't keep the customs you have, the norms you have, and it also basically you're bearing the burden of everybody else in the community. But what happens when Israel becomes like these towns, begins to look like these towns? Who's going to fund us? Who's going to defend us?
Right.
And these are the issues.
It's interesting. I've spoken a few times over the years in Silicon Valley to, Israelis who relocated specifically in high tech. And I came across something fascinating that it's sort of what I'd call broke the American dream. In other words, people I would meet would say, the American dream is come to America, work hard, put in roots and stay, that become Yankee Doodle dandies. These Israelis were saying to me, if I make it, my dream is to come back to Israel. In other words, it was, you don't find Indians or Russians or Chinese saying, if I make it, I'm moving back to Delhi or Calcutta. So I hear what you're saying, but does still seem to be, I think if things improve here, that it could become a magnet, people, those sectors could be coming back potentially.
I would even strengthen what you just said. When countries have a war, people flee. When we have a war, people return. All the flights inbound, you can't get places on the flights inbound because people are trying to return to defend Israel. That's a very unique situation, I think, in the global environment. People who left Israel feel Israelis. They want Israel to succeed. They leave for a variety of reasons, but wars basically show that you can't leave Israel behind, and they return and even put their lives on the line. And some of them lost their lives over the past 2 years. People who live already abroad returned here to defend Israel and paid with their lives. So we have a lot going for us in that regard. And to that, increasing sentiment against Israelis in particular and Jews in general at some of the places where we tend to go to, like universities and so on. And it increases the incentive to fix things here and not to take off and get it right.
So I started in historical in the 70s, and you in your report, you outline what I call a bold Israel 2.0 roadmap. If you had to prioritize just one reform to implement tomorrow morning to get us on the right path, what would it be and why?
Well, the first and foremost thing is education. That's the game changer, I think, in Israel. It doesn't mean to make Haredis secular or Arabs into Jews and so on. But we need to make sure that everyone who's in we are like other countries in the sense, you cannot not send your kid to school. It's not an option. But as opposed to other countries, we remove ourselves from insisting that they also learn something that gives them an opportunity in life. Okay, so we adopt that in some schools. And since the issue here is far beyond Haredim, like I said, we are below most of the developed world, even without the Haredim participating in the exam. So we need to fix the system. It's the worst education system in the developed world. And again, we have some of the best universities work. We just need to open the stop gaps, get it to the children, basically overhaul the entire education system, close it down at the end of the school year and open a new one at the beginning of the next year. And that way you have issues and just build it from scratch. And we know how to do it. There have been government commissions that said what we need to do and how we need to build it. But the main thing is we have to significantly upgrade our core education in the math, science, reading, civics. We have people here who don't distinguish between majority rule and tyranny of the majority. They don't have a clue on the basic understanding of separation of powers. We need to, people vote. People need to work in a modern economy. They have to have the tools to work and to understand also what they're voting for and how. That is the key thing. And not to leave anyone behind anymore, not to let the Haredim deprive their children of that kind of an education. Those are the rules of the game. We need everybody on board here. We need everybody also to work and have the skills to work so that the Haredim can be like physicians like Maimonides or engineers like the Rabbi from Lubavitch. It's not anti-Haredi, it's not anti-religious. This is something that developed in Israel, but was never here before. Haredim worked in Israel. At the end of the 70s, over 80% of the Haredim men worked, but we're very myopic. We think it wasn't the case. They
Right.
were.
So
They should.
if people want to know more about what you do, what Shoresh does, and their support, how can they find you, Dan?
Everything that I spoke about right now is on the Shoresh Institution website. It's shoresh.institute. And feel free to contact me. My email is there, or Cynthia, who's in charge of strategic partnerships, or click the donate button. We'd be very happy for your support. We are doing our best to reach everyone in Israel that can have an influence on the way things work, to knock heads together so that we work together to fix the future. I think it's possible, and I think we are in a unique moment in Israel's history that enables this.
Let's hope for better days. And as we look forward to your next report where some of these reforms have been instituted and we're on the right path.
I hope so.
I hope you enjoyed our podcast. Feel free to visit us at www.pstein.com or look for Philip Stein and Associates on Facebook and LinkedIn.